So our topic is all about soil and rock samples proper collection by Rinaldo Ripanoy and Michael Polinar. Layering of soil can be important to show a recent of historical presence at the location. So this is particularly true of vehicle collection and conserve layering whenever possible. So we need to preserve the true and documentation. Ensure that the portion of the object with the soil has been photographed and document in the notes in sketching. Includes measurements of collected soil and locations. So we need to first is photograph and document and sketch the evidence and comparison samples and marking of evidence. So evidence labeling. So label a container from each soil samples with your initial identification number, the date and time, the evidence number and the location, and the evidence description. When labeling each bundle or envelopes, bottles, the jars with the initial identification number, the evidence number, the date and time, location, and evidence description. So this is the example of the evidence labeling. So evidence number. So each piece of evidence must have a unique number. So this number should correspond the play card next to the evidence and the evidence log as appropriate. So they have the evidence, the control, or the comparison. So evidence description. The evidence description includes the location of each soil sample relative to specific landmarks at the scene, and whether the soil was wet or dry when collected, whether the soil contains any detectable odor of other unusual characteristics of object, and the estimated amount of sample. So muna ang mabutang sa evidence description. And remember, when describing soil contents, use the word apparent or the phrase of unknown origin. Wala ay nakabalo sa source, and the stains of marks is undefined. So soil sample taken from approximately 1 foot north of apparent footprint. So sa imong matubangan sa ubos, muna siya ang 1 foot north apparent footprint. So in determining where to begin the sample collection. So number 1, if a victim died on the ground and the body has not been removed, first of all, collect the sample from as close to the body as possible without disturbing it. So otherwise, prepare to collect a sample from the center of where the body laid and other appropriate locations of the body. So sa center sa body ka magkuha ng sample. And number 2, if collecting a series of samples along the path of an impression, determine the starts and end points of the path. So the starting points is the place where the first impression is made in the first sample must collected, then along the part traveled by the subject. So you collect, always use clean tools and individual binders when collecting soil and rock samples by the use of trowels and evidence binder. So if an impression, print, body, or other evidence is in the area, photograph and document it in the notes before collecting nearby soil and rocks. So bago ka mag-collect daw kuan the rock and soil, dapat naka-photograph and naka-document na siya. So collect the samples from the known crime scene or any alibi sites or representative sites. So sites that a victim or accused claims to have visited, and representative is such as sites where print the match recovered shoes or third are found. So, and when soil is firmly attached to movable object, collect and air dry the object before packaging it. If it cannot be collected, gently scrape samples from the object onto clean. So kung nari mga kuan daw kana mag-collect, dapat i-air dry daw or air dry bago i-collect or i-package. So and next is never package soil directly into commercially manufactured envelopes or bags. So dili basta-basta tamag package sa soil. Dapat always package soil in a sealable container, glass or plastic vials such as bottles or jars with screw cap, lids, self-made envelope, paper bundle, or other container. So collect a comparison sample close to the suspected or known evidence sample location at the virus location around the evidential sample up to 100 feet, attempting to include party soil in the scene area. So kani siya ma-explain ba ni siya sa mga next slides.
Good day, ma'am. I am Kadit Polinar, and this is the continuation of our report number 3. Examine the ground for trace evidence that have been collected. So, in order to trace evidence, we need to examine the ground to have an overview and secure that all evidences are being collected at the crime scene. Letter B. Dig straight down into the soil rock to collect a sample of 3 tablespoons to 1 cup of the soil. Be sure to start with clean digging tools. Clean the tools after each sample. Use mason tools, gardener, hand towel, and screwdriver as needed to dig straight into the ground or rocks. Be on mind to avoid the contamination of evidence. We need to secure that all digging tools are clean before it use and after it use. C. Place the soil sample into the container, bottle, jar, vial, and bindle. Mix soil as little as possible, keeping in mind the potential for layering of soil to avoid contamination and leakage. It is critical that each sample is stored in its own sealed container and kept apart from other soil, rock, sample, and tools that were used. At this point, the potential for layering of soil and it's relevant in avoiding contamination and linkage the evidence. All sample that has been collected at the crime scene will be stored by its own container. Also, the tools that being used to collect the evidence. Letter D. Collect and package the remaining sample in separate bundles. Take additional sample at distance of 1, 10, 25, and 50 feet from the original impression impact point. Recreate the diagram below. Size of area comprising the scene I will determine how far out the samples need to be taken. Take at least 4 samples at verifying compass point each time. The distance from the initial evidence area and sampling location is increased. As we see, collection of soil and rock samples at regular distance initial intervals from the original impression. We have 3. Letter A, 10 feet. Letter B, 50 feet. Letter C, 100 feet. Those are the additional sample distance from the original impression of evidence. Ensure that your notes and the label on the container include the compass direction and distance from the previous location or the initial evidence sample or permanent markers used for measurement in the scene. Whenever reference point is used, consistently use that point throughout. Letter E. If the sample is wet, place it on the clean piece of paper in a secure location. Used for evidence drying, such as drying rack, until it is dry. So if ever we collect wet evidence, we need to place it into clean piece of paper and secure the location used for evidence drying. Before we collect the evidence, in order to protect the evidence and to avoid contamination and linkage, we need to dry the evidence in the secure location and wait until it's dry before we package. Letter F. If drugs or ignitable liquids are suspected, the sample must be frozen. Contact a fire investigation or fire duress analysis if ignitable liquids are suspected. So keep the sample as cold as possible. Help to show degradation. Natural components of some soil may degrade the composition of added chemicals in the sample. So as possible, we need to keep the sample or initial evidence cold to maintain and to avoid contamination or linkage. Packaging. Place each initial container, bottle, jar, vial, bundle into its labeled container. Only one soil sample per container. Do not package evidence with comparison, control, sample. So, each initial container, which is bottle, jar, or bundled or whatsoever, we need to label and each sample container, only one soil occupied, and we do not package it with comparison and control sample, which is the soil and rock. We need to separate between the soil and the rock so that we secure all the initial evidence after we examine. Close the container and seal the entire opening with the tape. So in order to protect and secure the evidence were collected at the crime scene, we need to seal and or close into container with the use of tape for the purpose of avoiding contamination. Write your initial, identification number, and the date and time across the evidence tape seal. So in order to have an overview where the evidence we found out. That's all, ma'am. Thank you.